Dear colleagues, happy to see you today. I would like to introduce the discussion about RT. This is the book that I edited. I'm not a single author of this book. Actually, it's written mostly by other people, by colleagues, by scholars, by researchers, by investigative journalists. All the chapters in the book were finished before the full-blown invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in February. Only my introduction was finished after the start of this full-blown invasion. So in April 2005, the Kremlin press secretary, whom you will see here, Alexei Gromov, saw a 25-year-old journalist from the Kremlin reporting pool, and she was reading a book in English. He said, "So you're reading a book in English on the US history?" She says, "For dummies." Gromov continued, "So you know the US Secretary, Condoleezza Rice, is going to visit Moscow soon, and she's a really tough woman." The journalist felt like she had to show her knowledge of the US. And she proceeded, "The key to understanding of the US is the Protestant ethics. The US-style Protestantism makes a person very powerful and at the same time extremely brutal. A Protestant should work a lot to achieve success and cannot get distracted by things like quiet contemplation or internal dialogues, which are so dear to the Russian heart. For us, melancholic and contemplative people, it is really hard to understand that a Protestant cannot sympathize with weak people if he himself turned to be weak, even if he himself turned out to be weak." Gromov kept on listening. The journalist continued, "It is no coincidence that only one US president was not a Protestant." And Gromov asked, "Perhaps you know who that was?" "That was Kennedy, of course, and we all remember how it all ended." Gromov's face suddenly changed and he said, "That's it. Your fate is sealed." Probably some of you know who that journalist was. That journalist was Margarita Simonian. That was 2005. She just turned 25. She was 24 just a month before that conversation. Gromov, as the press secretary of the Kremlin, a month later, in May 2005, invited her to his office. To circle back a few years before that conversation, the Minister for Communications for the press, Mihai Lesin, went to the US. And at that time, just in the beginning of the noughties, Putin was still in his first presidential term, and Lesin returned from the US, and he started discussing with people that he knew, probably with Putin himself, although there is no knowledge of it. He started talking about the very bad reputation of Russia in the West, and the US in particular. So basically his argument was that, do you know how they look at us, Russians, in Russia? They think that Russia is some sort of a land of drunken bears who drink vodka all the time and play matryoshkas. You know, they don't really know anything about us. This is their image of us. We need to do something. And already at that time, he would say, well, there's nothing wrong with propaganda, but we need to propagandize the best of us, the best what we have in Russia. That was his argument when he returned from the US. But apart from this probably very low or very bad knowledge of Russia in the US and in the West in general, there was also another problem. You may remember that in the beginning of 2000, there was still the Second Chechen War going on. And the West criticized Russia heavily for the First Chechen War, for the Second Chechen War. Actually, at the end of the 90s, the US considered very seriously whether to introduce sanctions on Russia to punish for the war crimes that the Russian Federation committed in Chechnya. They didn't introduce any sanctions at that time, but there was a very serious consideration of the sanctions. There was this need to have a particular media resource that would promote Russia on the international arena. That was 2001, 2002, 2003. This conversation kept on going. Lesin was very interested in doing the channel, but it may sound very, very strange today, well, given the entire context today, given the technological capabilities. But at that time, Russia did not have any technological capabilities to start a channel that they wanted to have. At that time, it was very costly. The prices for Russian gas and oil were not very high at that time. There was no possibility, either financial or technological, and that was, again, it was very expensive to start such a channel. And the idea was that we want to have something like CNN, a TV network that would produce content that would be like BBC, like CNN, you know, promoting Russia's image abroad. They were able to do such a thing only in 2005. So in May 2005, Gromov invited Simonyan to his office, and at the meeting in that office, also Mihai Lesin was present. Mihai Lesin was very skeptical about the candidacy of Margarita Simonyan. She was very young. She was just turned 25. She was only known for essentially being a cheerleader for the Kremlin. She was working in this Kremlin pool, and as you may understand, only people who are uber loyal to the Kremlin, to the president, could be really part of that reporting pool. But she was offered a job, and after some consideration, as she describes in her blog, and that anecdote was actually taken from her blog, she decided to take up the offer. So they tell her, well, we need to, yeah, it's May now, in autumn we need to have this channel already. So it was very fast. They actually did not manage to build Russia Today by autumn that year, but by December they had it. So that was the beginning. But talking about the very origins of Russia Today, and the idea of having its own soft power tool was very important. But there is, I think, another very important consideration, putting the emergence of Russia Today into an international context. An international context was that in the 90s, obviously if we're talking about the English language, TV networks or media, international media, we would obviously think of American media, who would have their international departments, and also BBC. The Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was obviously also very present, but perhaps not on the same level as these public services like BBC. However, things started to change, and I want to show you this context. In 1992, Deutsche Welle started its own international project. Then it was followed by China, that in the year 2000 started its own international TV channel. And then you have a surge of different TV channels, international TV channels appeared in the period between 2005-2006. Russia Today, also the emergence of Russia Today, also falls into this very context. If you notice, with the exception of France, and I'm sure that France was looking at the trends and thought, okay, we need to do something. Even the Germans have their own TV channels. Now the Russians have their own TV channel. We need to do something. This is how France 24 International appeared. But the other 4 TV channels, the Venezuela's Telesur, then Al Jazeera English, Press TV from Iran, these are TV channels that are coming from the rich oil countries. So rich oil countries, and that coincides with the surge of the prices for oil. They decided, okay, so we have money, but now we need to have some influence on other nations to improve probably our reputation abroad, to improve our image abroad. So this is the international context of the emergence of Russia Today, in addition to the very domestic, very internal considerations of the Russian leadership for the need of such a channel. Talking about the emergence and the creation of Russia Today, Vladimir Putin in 2013 provided his own vision and his own thoughts on the creation, although it should be kept in mind that 2013 was very, very different from 2005. So his own interpretation may be a little bit biased because of some developments that happened in the period between 2005-2013. Nevertheless, I think it is important to see his own interpretation. He was saying that when we designed this project back in 2005, we proceeded from the premise that one more strong player had to emerge on the world information scene, a player that would not just provide an unbiased coverage of what was happening in Russia, but would also try, and I want to stress, try, to break the Anglo-Saxon monopoly on the global information streams. In the period between 2005 and 2008, Russia Today was a very small channel, despite the fact that they tried very hard to turn it into some sort of a Russian CNN. It was still really, really small. It was only in English language. The only criticism at that time that you can imagine of Russia Today, coming from the Western press, coming from Western academia, was that, well, it was just, very state-sponsored TV channel that would never produce any criticism of the Kremlin. It was only about how good Russia is. So that was the main message: Russia is good, and that was, in the end, that was the main aim, the main objective of creation of our Russia Today at that time. So many Western scholars, Western experts, they would rather prefer to read some materials in Russian coming from other media sources, Russian media sources, domestic, to know about Russia rather than watch Russia Today, because indeed it was just cheerleading for the Kremlin. But everything started to change in 2008. Namely in August 2008. This is when the Russian-Georgian war that lasted only 5 days took place. Russia won the war very easily, just in 5 days, but there was a consensus among the Kremlin experts and the people close to the Kremlin and close to President Dmitry Medvedev at that time. The understanding was that the success, the military success, was very easy, but they failed in terms of information warfare. They failed to convince the West that Russia's actions in Georgia were justified, that the occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia were justified, and that it could be considered a peacekeeping operation. And that was the official name of the operation back in 2008, the peacekeeping operation. And I will give you some quotes which I find very telling in this regard, how they considered, how the Russian experts and Kremlin experts considered this 5-day war against Georgia. So Anton Vuyma, one of the journalists, would write, "The Russian military campaign in the northern Caucasus can be considered a victorious one, but Russia has definitely lost the information war that the US waged on us. In the eyes of almost all the countries of the world, Russia is seen as an aggressor that has attacked a weak Georgian state." Gleb Pavlovsky also in 2008 wrote that Russia's loss in the information war with the Western media was determined by the lack of Russian global media. And again, just remember, Russia Today already existed at that time. Yeah? And one more quote from 2013, by a Russian military expert who said that Russia lost the information war because it had not been prepared for it at all. To win an information warfare in the future, Russia needed to employ information forces that would engage in propaganda, disinformation, and cooperation with the international media. These information forces would supply the international media with ready-to-use imagery for which script writers were needed. So that was the understanding what happened in August 2008. And since they already had Russia Today, they thought that it needed to be reconceptualized. It needed to be, probably rebuilt, almost from scratch. The ways that they started to rebuild it were, in my opinion, suggested, at least to a certain degree, by international actors, by some activists, by some politicians, who were actually ready to endorse Russia's actions in Georgia back in August 2008. And one of those people was an American far-right activist, Lyndon LaRouche. He died recently, just a few years ago. And in August 2008, Russia Today, it was still Russia Today, although you see that they already had this logo of RT. He would provide his commentary for Russia Today, saying that the Georgian assault on South Ossetia was probably a British-led operation with the US support. So that was really welcome by Russia Today and Russian media in general, because it showed that there are some Western activists, Western politicians, who were on Russia's side. And that was, well, first it was very rare, and this is why they would go after anyone who would provide such a description as LaRouche did. They decided to reconceptualize RT, Russia Today, and the process took place in 2008-2009. First, they renamed Russia Today into RT, but not to conceal any Russian origins of the TV channel. That was a reflection of a new Russia Today, of a new RT. It was no longer about Russia. So Russia Today was, as the name implied, was about Russia. RT became a TV channel primarily about the West. So if the narrative, the main message of Russia Today was that Russia is good, the message of RT became the West is bad. That was the main difference between two forms or two types of the same channel. Margarita Simonyan remained the editor-in-chief of these new reconceptualized RT, and at some point, while still insisting that RT was just normal media, like all the other media in the world, she at the same time started to promote the idea that, well, you cannot be a media without a bias, without a political bias. And she arrived at the conclusion that, yes, we are trying to be like all the other media, especially in the West, especially in the US, but these American media, they're also propagandistic. They also promote their own disinformation when it's needed by them. So why can't we do this? And in 2012, she started making remarks and making commentary, trying to explain RT or the need for RT in actually weaponized terms. She started talking about RT as some sort of a defense ministry. So she said in 2012, RT is like a defense ministry. The TV channel should be prepared for an information war well in advance, because it was impossible to only start making a weapon when the war has already started. And in 2013, she elaborated on the same idea, saying that the information weapon, of course, is used in critical moments, and war is always a critical moment. The information weapon is a weapon like any other. Of course, the defense ministry cannot start training soldiers, preparing weaponry, and generally making itself from scratch when the war has already started. If we do not have an audience today, tomorrow, and the day after, it will be the same as in 2008. So she was referring to this 2008, this crucial moment in the history of Russia Today, of RT, and actually it would not be an exaggeration to say of the history of Russia's soft power. That was a really crucial moment. So they needed to have an information weapon ready, and RT and Margarita Simonyan would consider RT as such a weapon. The main idea of the new reconceptualized RT was that the West is bad. So they needed to have people, they needed to have commentators who would advance this message. And obviously they needed international actors, they needed international stakeholders, politicians, activists, journalists who would promote this message, because RT was primarily targeting not Russia, not the domestic audience, but the outside audience. There were many far-right commentators for RT from the moment of this reconceptualization. And again, the fact that Lyndon LaRouche, this American far-right activist, was happy to contribute to Russia Today was also this message that they could rely on the far right, they could rely on the far left, but that would be actually later a little bit, but they could rely on isolationists, they could rely on conspiracy theorists. So they would have, for example, American neo-Nazi Richard Spencer as an expert on Libya when the Arab Spring was discussed in 2012. Interestingly enough, and that was another very, very peculiar turn for Russia Today. So before the emergence of RT, or Russia Today 2.0, they would talk about the far right and about fascists as sort of objects of condemnation. The existence of the far right in the West, the existence of fascists in the West was more of a, you have these bastards in the West, and Russia is such an anti-fascist country. But at some point, they started inviting the far-right politicians and far-right activists, not as politicians to talk about their successes or failures in politics, but as actual commentators. So Richard Spencer, who I'm sure I'm not mistaken, had really actually no idea about Libya, was still invited to RT in order to provide his commentary that would be given through this perspective of anti-liberal or illiberal perspective, a perspective, say, against the Arab Spring, against revolutions, etc., etc. That was the point of having those people on RT. Or, for example, when Donald Trump won the elections, they would invite Dutch far-right politicians, Geert Wilders, to comment on the victory of Donald Trump. So the preference was given not to actual experts, but people that had a very clear political bias. And that bias, of course, was underpinned by anti-system, anti-establishment, very populist considerations and ideologies. Or, for example, when they wanted to, that was just a few years before, there was a terror attack in Stockholm, and they would invite for a report on that terror attack that was carried out by a person of non-Swedish origins. They invited around 5 people. Out of these 5, 4 represented the far right. And the other, I think the other 5th was just a policeman or something of the sort. So there was a very clear perspective that RT tried to promote. Another very peculiar aspect of RT was its reliance on conspiracy theories. And already in 2010, the researcher Sonia Scher wrote that RT reported with boosterish zeal on conspiracy theories popular in the resurgent patriot movement. There's a right-wing American movement whose adherents typically advocate extreme anti-government doctrines. And she listed some of the conspiracy theories that were especially or specifically popular with RT at that time. 9/11 attacks being an inside job, that Barack Obama was born outside of the US, and so he was ineligible for the presidency. Another conspiracy theory was that the US was a tool of the New World Order. And Ilya Yablokov, a colleague of mine and also a contributor to this report, he wrote in his own research, he identified 2 major types of conspiracy theories that RT was promoting. Well, first was genuinely American conspiracy theories. So this is where RT actually didn't have to invent anything. They just took the authentic domestic American conspiracy theories and made them bigger, promoted them. So that was one type, and the second type that he wrote about was ideas of conspiracy and the relations between the US and Russia. Some of those conspiracy theories, they are still alive. I think the major one is that the US thinks that Russia has too many natural resources, such as gas and oil, and Russia does not deserve to have those resources. But this idea, and you may know this, it comes from a really fringe theory that was published many years ago in some very obscure sources. And the people who invented, or I don't know how to describe it really. So they try to analyze Madeleine Albright's thoughts by looking at her photograph. And that was the analysis that was actually published in one of those really, I don't know, probably even underground conspiratorial Russian resources. But that particular idea, it made it completely to the mainstream in the Russian Federation. But at that time, when this conspiratorial turn was taking place for RT, they would have people like Aymeric Choprad. At that time, he was still, he was with the Front National, the major French far-right party at that time. He was an advisor on geopolitics for Marine Le Pen. And he was invited to RT's show to talk about some theories about 9/11 being, again, an inside job. And he would also, RT would refer to him as a dissident voice in the French academic world, a critic of Western policies towards Russia. And he was given a chance to talk why he was fired from the college where he taught. Well, because he was accused that in his book he was promoting these conspiracy theories about 9/11. Interestingly enough, for many people who were introduced to these Russian influence operations, it didn't really end with just being a commentator for RT. And the same Amerik Choprat, he was one of the so-called observers at the sham referendum in Crimea. You can see him here on the right, he's second from the right. As I said, you will be able to read much of about RT in this collection of chapters, especially on different versions of RT. As I mentioned, at some point, RT also started introducing editions in other languages, most prominently in German, in French, in Spanish, in Arabic. Arabic edition is not covered here. It only concerns with Europe, but just a little bit also beyond, because the Spanish language edition of RT, RT en Español, targets not so much Spain as Latin America. This is where it's particularly prominent. You will find a research how RT covered the COVID-19 pandemic, and again how it used conspiracy theories. But as you may know, RT started to have problems with the authorities and with some IT giants such as Google already last year. So because of very biased, very populist reporting on the pandemic, YouTube deleted the German version of RT from its own video service. And at the same time, the German version of RT was never actually able to get to the cable, despite many attempts to do so, because Germany has very strict laws about state-controlled, state-sponsored media being represented on the cable in Germany. What's also interesting, and I really advise you to read if you're interested in this topic, how RT covered the pandemic, and you will see that the reporting on the pandemic on the Spanish language of RT, in comparison to other editions, is almost normal. It's almost mainstream. The difference here is in the audience, because as I said, in the Spanish language of RT targets mostly Latin America. And in Latin America, they target mostly the leftist, left-wing, center-left audiences. And they have to behave in a way. While in France and in Germany, they target mostly the right-wing and the really far left. So the far right and the far left. And they adapt actually to the audiences that they target, and they try to feed to those audiences particular narratives underpinned or tailor-made for the country and for the ideological convictions of the audiences that they want to target. I want to conclude this discussion and this introduction by saying that after the start of the full-blown invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation on the 24th of February this year, the European Union, the US, and some other countries decided to block RT completely. As I mentioned, the German version of RT had already disappeared even before that from YouTube because of the German authorities and the coverage and the very anti-systemic, anti-establishment populist coverage of the pandemic. There was a lot of disinformation about the pandemic. So 8 years after the actual start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but because of this full-blown invasion, they decided to close down. Google removed RT from the search results. Facebook, Twitter removed pages of RT from their own services. RT was hit very, very hard. Nevertheless, these editions, they did not disappear. And the editorial offices are still working. They found other platforms, other video hosting services, obviously not as popular as YouTube, of course, but still it is operational. And we also see that following the changes in Russian foreign policy orientations, and especially when it comes to information warfare and political warfare and soft power, RT is also reorienting itself in new ways. For example, RT France, the French language version of RT, is now targeting increasingly Africa, French-speaking countries in Africa, and this also reflects the general orientation or general interests of the Russian Federation today. So this collection of chapters is not a funeral note. It's not the end of RT. And also one important thing, whatever Western countries are doing to limit the spread of RT, still they will find ways to promote their ideas, perhaps using some of the techniques that they had already with Russia Today, with RT, and perhaps using some other ways to advance their own interests. So, thank you.